The title of my presentation is Violence and Defiance, A Brief History of Black Death and Radicalism in the Last Century. Jelani Cobb's New Yorker article, Between the World and Ferguson, sets the tone for my essay as it speaks to our discussion. Here we are in Bengaluru discussing the Black Lives Matter movement many miles away, but its ramifications, its outcomes, and its demands affect us all. It is a call, like many that have been voiced in the past, it is a call for recognition in the face of nationalist dismissal. While African Americans remember the horrors of the last 400 years, people in power would rather forget these struggles and begin a post-racial society with Obama at its head. Unfortunately, the events in Ferguson, New York, Detroit, Baltimore, and recently Charleston, South Carolina, will not allow these ideas to persist. This presentation will examine the radical and creative ways African Americans have fought against police brutality, Jim Crow laws, and racism by uniting, marching, and protesting. Ultimately, it leads us to this present moment, which champions this one demand: stop killing us. So this is a picture of one of the protests happening in Ferguson, Missouri last year that happened after the death of Michael Brown. So often the protesters were confronted by the National Guard and shot with rubber bullets and tear gas. And since, as of, this information is correct up until June 4th, but there have been 893 protests since August 9th, 2014, which was the day Michael Brown was killed. So Michael Brown was shot 6 times by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. His body was left on the ground for 4.5 hours before receiving medical attention. And this happened on August 9th, 2014. He was just about to go to college. Trayvon Martin was shot and killed 2 years before Michael Brown by George Zimmerman. And in both of these cases, Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, the people who committed the crimes were not reprimanded judicially. Black Lives Matter was founded after Trayvon Martin's murder in 2012, by Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. You can see a picture of all 3 of the women here. And they directly talk about the absence of Black women, although it's not often framed that way in the media. Black Lives Matter has been framed, especially in the media representation, as a struggle for Black men's rights, as opposed to rights for all Black people. But Alicia Garza, the woman in the black and white, has written that Black Lives Matter is a unique contribution that goes beyond the extrajudicial killings of Black people by police and vigilantes. It goes beyond the narrow nationalism that can be prevalent within some Black communities, keeping straight Black men in the front of the movement while, let me read this directly, while our sisters, queer and trans and disabled folk, take up roles in the backgrounds or not at all. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black, queer, and trans folk, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. It is a tactic to rebuild the Black liberation movement. So Black Lives Matter has been spreading statistics that say every 28 hours, a Black man, woman, or child is murdered by police or vigilante law. And the Black Lives Matter manifesto attempts to broaden the conversation around state violence to include all the ways in which Black people are intentionally left powerless by the hands of the state. We are talking about the ways in which Black lives are deprived of basic rights, basic human rights and dignity, how Black poverty and genocide is state violence. Aligning with the tradition of the Black Panther Party, Black Lives Matter, in collaboration with Justice for Mike Brown and Hands Up United, has proposed a new vision for a new America that reads like the 10-point program. Some of the demands are similar, as they call for an end to all forms of discrimination and the full recognition of human rights, full employment, decent housing, and freedom from mass incarceration, and the end of the prison industrial complex. Other demands speak directly to those in power, suggesting support of the End Racial Profiling Act and calling the Obama administration to develop and enact a national plan of action for racial justice. The End Racial Profiling Act was introduced into the United States Congress in May 2013 and called for the prohibition of racial profiling by law enforcement. It has recently been reintroduced to Congress earlier this year. Congress proposed that tactics such as stop and frisk, which is really prevalent in urban areas, where the police can stop you, whether you're running to the train, trying to make it to work, and if they say that you look suspicious or that you may be carrying a suspicious object, they can stop and search you at any time, no matter how long, no matter if it's interrupting your day or anything like that. They can just immediately stop you. And if they have any kind of inkling that you might be up to no good, they could arrest you. But between stop and frisk and spontaneous traffic investigations, these two tactics have been terrorizing the Black community for centuries, for years, not centuries. But Congress wanted to respond to these tactics by awarding departments that comply with the collection of data about racial profiling a monetary grant. And this act is just one of many legislative changes the new vision seeks to implement. Other demands specifically confront the Department of Justice and law enforcement, as the new vision calls for repurposing of law enforcement funds to support community-based alternatives to incarceration and the demilitarization of law enforcement across the country. The private prison industry has grown significantly in the last 50 years, and education costs have been replaced by funneling money into this budding venture. So my slide here shows from the gap in incarceration rates from 1960 to 2010. And at the top, you can see Black men. In 1960, the rate was 1,313. By 2010, 4,347. That's an extremely large gap in the increase in incarceration rates. And you can see for Black women, there's also a gap higher than those comparable to white and Hispanic groups. And in April 20th, 2015, New York Times article said that for every 100 Black women who are not incarcerated, there are only 83 Black men who are there and available, who are not incarcerated or not in prison or died. So thus 1.5 million Black men are essentially, between the ages of 25 and 54, are essentially missing. So the rising prison industrial complex and the increasing rate of incarceration is really removing a large number of Black men from the larger society. And also significantly affects education, because in 2013, Philadelphia closed 23 public schools, arguing that there was no money left for these programs, but built a $400 million private prison miles away from the city. Housing inmates has become a lucrative business, while educating citizens and providing opportunities for growth in different sectors of our economy has rapidly gone into decline. The new vision demands for a new America do not only attack the prison industrial complex and law enforcement, but capitalist desires at the heart, and shed light on how practices such as racial profiling and discrimination work to the benefit of the rich, but not the citizens who need local and national infrastructure to achieve the American dream. So I'm just gonna briefly talk about Black radicalism in the 20th century, as we have a limited amount of time, but I'd like to highlight a few activists and movements. So the Red Record was a text published in 1895 by Ida B. Wells, and she spoke about the horrors of lynching, talking about what was happening in the North and the South. There was often the misconception that lynching was only taking place in southern states, but she also showed how there were still cases of lynching happening in the North and racial profiling. And she later went on to become a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was founded in 1909. And the NAACP, in conjunction with other groups such as the National Association of Colored Women, founded in 1896, really worked to provide education to the recently freed families and set up infrastructure for Black communities to rebuild economically. Mary McLeod Bethune, who founded Bethune-Cookman College in Florida, she's another Black woman, and Booker T. Washington, black man who founded the Tuskegee Institute, both set up programs for African Americans to be able to learn and develop their communities after slavery. But the threat of lynching, police, and unsanctioned state and civil violence continued to remain a threat throughout this time, especially during the Great Migration. And I have a slide showing the Migration series by Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence is a painter, writer, activist in the time of the Harlem Renaissance, and he and his wife documented the Great Migration, where African American families were moving north to go seek better job opportunities and just escape some of the deep hatred and racism in the southern states. But in the top photo, I have them going, and Jacob Lawrence portrays African Americans going to New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, big urban cosmopolitan cities. But in the second picture, I have the results of the massive influx of African Americans to these big cities. There were often race riots in which many African Americans were left dead, or there were high tensions because of the lack of jobs in these cities. So in addition to the NAACP and the National Association for Colored Women, there were also other black radical movements, such as the United Negro Improvement Association, founded in 1914 by Marcus Garvey. He was actually from Jamaica, but came to the United States because he was inspired by Booker T. Washington's vocational school program, and he wanted to recreate something that would allow African Americans and African descended people to set up their own infrastructure, their own businesses, and succeed. So what he tried to create was the Black Star Line, which would be an import-export company transporting African goods to and from America, and also giving black people to start anew on the African continent. And from the United Negro Improvement Association, many other groups formed, such as the African Blood Brotherhood, which was one of the first organizations and founded by 2 men and 1 African American woman, the African Blood Brotherhood was. And it was one of the first organizations to set up self-defense for the black community in Harlem, and also partnered with the Communist Party and tried to expand communist ideology around the United States. Black women especially contributed heavily to these movements, as black women saw the Communist Party as a way to escape the racism of the United States. And it also provided black women the opportunity to center the conversation on gender equality. So black women coined the term triple oppression at this time, and believed that the eradication of one form of oppression requires a concurrent dismantlement of all types of oppression. So from the beginning, they were lobbying that everyone can get free once we start talking about how race, gender, and class all come together to provide racial discrimination and inequality within our society. And these black communists were able to travel to the Soviet Union, talk about their story, share their story, and really inspire the communist leaders to invest in understanding more about the African American struggle. And the travel allowed them to expand their personal notions of how black people can be treated, function, and live outside of the American context. So during the Red Scare that persecuted communists, many activists went underground. However, the African American community still fought discrimination. James Baldwin's 1963, The Fire Next Time, discussed the post-World War II realities of many African American war veterans. And The Fire Next Time is a famous text because James Baldwin uses the book of Genesis to explain the coming revolution, which would be the coming civil rights movement and eventually the Black Panther Party. And so one of the most quoted lines from The Fire Next Time is, "God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, but fire next time." So it just speaks to the protest and the fire raging under the surface of American life. So the civil rights movement was especially gained traction after the killing of Emmett Till in 1955, where he was brutally murdered for allegedly winking or speaking to a white woman. And the unrestrained and unrestricted civilian violence against black Americans, coupled with police violence, sparked a nationwide outrage amongst African Americans that led to the Civil Rights Movement. Some successes of the Civil Rights Movement were the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Brown v. Board of Education case in 1954, which desegregated the public schools. But even with these important acts, discrimination still existed, and the Black Panther Party created opportunities for community uplift and confronted police in urban communities. So the Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland in 1966, and they were really influenced by Frantz Fanon, Mao, Marx, and really tried to foster a kind of global radical ideology for change, uniting all types of groups. One of my colleagues, Jacoby Williams, has studied the Black Panther Party in depth, but I wanted to highlight the Black Panther Party's international involvement as they set up international headquarters in Algeria in 1969, which was spearheaded by Eldridge Cleaver and his wife, Kathleen Cleaver, which are pictured in the photo right here. And when they set up the when they set up the international headquarters of the Black Panther Party, there was a national conference there in Algeria, a Pan-African cultural festival, in which there were many African nations represented, Palestinians were there, and Algerians, and they came together to talk about liberation, rewriting history, and what it means to tell your own story. And this meeting continued the conversation that took place at Bandung just 25 years earlier, but the Black Panther Party still faced the threat of police brutality. And the FBI-sponsored program called COINTELPRO eventually stabilized the Black Panther Party because it infiltrated the movement. There were many arrests of Black Panther Party leaders, and some are still imprisoned, even to this day, such as former Black Panther Party member Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's still in prison in New York City. Back to the Black Lives Matter movement, I'd like to talk about commodification of Black death and destruction of property. So Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, Reparations for Ferguson, in The Atlantic, explains the police departments of America are endowed by the state with dominion over your body. This summer, in Ferguson and Staten Island, we have seen that dominion employed to maximum ends, destruction of the body. Coates elucidates how the Black body is still viewed as less than human, and the commodification of the Black body is still in effect. Similarly, William Anderson's article, From Lynching Photos to Michael Brown's Body, Commodification of Black Death, discusses how images and videos of Black people being killed is also problematic. Anderson writes, Black people whose lives have been taken become a common of sorts. Their bodies are utilized as signs of solidarity, collective struggle, and rallying points, but also as media commodities. We must be aware that this metamorphosis of their bodies into durable tools puts us at risk of desensitizing ourselves to their fatalities. When Eric Garner was killed in Staten Island by a chokehold last year, his famous last words, "I can't breathe," appeared on t-shirts representing the movement. Miami Heat basketball player LeBron James in the center and Chicago Bulls basketball player Derrick Rose, all the way at the end, were photographed wearing the shirts before the game. However, these shirts are an example of a commodification of a person's last words for the sake of a movement. Garner's life was disseminated into one phrase instead of focusing on the fullness of his entire life. As the movement goes forward, the commodification of Black death for public consumption is something I really want to bring into the dialogue. Similarly, the relationship between Black death and property has come into discussion after the burning of a gas station in Ferguson by protesters. Instead of covering peaceful protests taking place within the city, the media focused on the burning of the gas station and the lootings happening, attempting to shift the conversation from state violence to the destruction of property. Likewise, the burning of the CVS after the mysterious murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore was given more media coverage than the reason Freddie Gray entered the police car with no injuries and arrived at the police station with a severed spine. This is a picture of Freddie Gray, and Baltimore was one of the protests where people were destroying police cars. There were riots in the streets. They called the National Guard in for Baltimore as well, but it was described as just, they put Baltimore under curfew, And people were afraid to go to the city of Baltimore or even leave their homes because of the riots taking place there. But this is a picture of the CVS that was burning in Baltimore, and the police standing out front preventing any of the protesters from even getting near it. But Black activists have taken to social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr to keep examples of discrimination, violence, and racism in the public eye. Social media sites have also helped to unite oppressed groups internationally. So during the Ferguson protests, Palestinians were tweeting to protesters on the ground in Ferguson how to deal with the effects of tear gas. Relatedly, the Dream Defenders, an organization dedicated to spreading awareness about police brutality, went to the West Bank in Palestine to experience Israeli apartheid in January. The Dream Defenders' experiences in Palestine and the solidarity between Palestinian and Black activists show how the Black Lives Matter movement has been spreading globally, just as the Black Panther Party and the Civil Rights Movement did years before. So I wanted to point out a few tweets that were sent to activists in terms of Ferguson solidarity. And some of the people are saying, always make sure to run against the wind. Remember not to touch your face when tear gassed or put water on it. But these kind of examples of solidarity are really important, I believe, as we move forward, especially in terms of connecting Black Lives Matter and Dalit Lives Matter as a movement. So the Black Lives Matter is a movement that has been brewing for years after the Black Panther Party and has culminated after the death of many men and women by police brutality and civilian violence. In many ways, it shows how stagnant some parts of America still are in regards to treating Black people as human beings and respecting their right to live. In other ways, it shows how things have progressed, as new media platforms have risen that allow for fast international connections. Yet as much as things have changed, many things remain the same. I believe Black Lives Matter operates in the Black radical tradition of the NAACP, the UNIA, and the Black Panther Party. Building on this legacy, Black Lives Matter has chosen to tackle police brutality, economic inequality, and the private prison complex. The scattered nature of the movement allows anyone to participate as long as they have a desire to change and confront the system, and also internet access. It is as much a social media revolution as a physical movement, as people have been doing work on the ground and online. In these coming months, following the movement will become even more important, as I foresee more police and civilian violence continuing. Here's a picture dedicated to the 9 people killed in Charleston, South Carolina by Dylan Roof on June 17th. And the killing of the 9 members of the church and Reverend Clementa Pinckney at Morris Brown African Methodist Episcopal Church was done, in his words, because they were Black. Hate crimes such as these significantly impact the African American community, as places of worship are not even safe from harm. The movement continues to tackle this important question. How do we convince people that Black lives matter? This will remain the question as we go forward. So I just wanted to share a few photos of the things I've seen while being in New York, and also share some information that they haven't shared in the media. So while I was reading more about what's been happening stateside throughout this trip, I saw a hashtag on Twitter called "Who is Burning Black Churches?" And I found out that since the Charleston, South Carolina shooting, 8 churches have been burned to the ground in all across the United States. They've been burned in Ohio, Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia. But all this is absent from media coverage right now. But in response to those burnings, Muslim American activists in America decided to launch a crowdfunding campaign to raise money to rebuild the Black churches. And it was launched on July 2nd, and within 12 hours they had raised $10,000. And today they have raised up to $57,275 to support the rebuilding of Black churches. And within the crowdfunding campaign, the activists were saying, we can't ignore the struggle of what's been happening to Black Americans, and we want to do whatever we can to help them rebuild. So it just shows that these connections are possible and important as we go forward. But in terms of what I've seen in New York City, so this is at NYU, New York University, and that's me in the yellow hoodie, my Malcolm X hoodie. And we had a die-in at New York University. The die-in is representing the time that Michael Brown was left on the ground without any medical attention. So he was left on the ground for 4.5 hours, as I said, and we stayed on the ground for 1 hour, representing 1/4 of the time that Michael Brown was lying dead on the ground. And originally, the community had tried to box us in to a smaller area so we wouldn't draw attention to or create a ruckus with the other students and the faculty. But so many people came out to support that we exceeded those boundaries. And there were a mix of all races, all religions there supporting the die-in. And these also happened across the United States. NYU's, there was one at Harvard, there's one at Notre Dame. They're all over the US, these die-ins happening at student protests. And this is another picture I took at the protest of a student saying that, you know, like, it could be my brother or my sister who had been killed. It could be any one of us. This is also a photo of the police in riot gear right before the protest, where if you come to show support, you would be confronted by police with riot gear, with sticks, and with zip ties ready to arrest you at any time. In fact, a lot of people were arrested during the Millions March, in which 70,000 people came out to march against police brutality in New York. I believe about 140 people were arrested peacefully marching. And then this is I went to Baltimore after the protest, and this is a picture of the CBS. As you see, it's still standing. So it just shows that, and on the wall it says, you know, like Freddie Gray, in memory of Freddie Gray, and telling the police not to continue the violence. So those are just a few photos I wanted to share with you all about Black Lives Matter and what I've learned and what I've participated in, and I hope it's been helpful. Okay, thank you.